In 325 BCE, a Greek navigator named Pytheas set sail beyond the known world and discovered frozen seas, lands where the sun never set, and places no map had ever drawn. But when he returned, they called him the greatest liar in history. 2,000 years later, when every word he spoke was proven true, he was already lost to time. Before we begin, subscribe to uncover the stories history tried to bury and ensure no explorer's voice is silenced forever. Before starting the story, don't forget to subscribe, like and comment. The Mediterranean sun beat down on the port of Massalia as Pytheas stood before the council of merchants, his weathered hands gripping a scroll that would change everything. He was 42 years old, a respected astronomer and geographer, known for his precise calculations and careful observations. But what he was proposing now seemed like madness to the wealthy traders who funded expeditions. "I want to sail north," Pytheas said, his voice steady despite the skeptical faces before him, "beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond Britannia, to the edge of the world itself." The eldest merchant laughed, a sound like dry parchment. "The edge of the world? Pytheas, you've spent too long staring at stars. There is nothing beyond Britannia but storms and monsters." But Pytheas knew better. He had spent years studying tidal patterns, celestial movements, and the stories whispered by sailors who dared venture into northern waters. He had calculated something remarkable, that the world extended far beyond what any Greek had documented, and he needed to see it with his own eyes. "I will map the unknown," Pytheas insisted. "I will measure the sun's height at the summer solstice in the farthest north. I will document the peoples, the lands, the seas, and I will return with knowledge that will make Massalia the greatest trading power in the Mediterranean." What Pytheas didn't tell them was the real reason for his journey. In his private studies, he had discovered ancient Phoenician texts that spoke of a mysterious land called Thula, a place where the sun circled the horizon without setting, where the ocean turned to ice, and where the boundary between sea and sky disappeared. Most scholars dismissed these accounts as mythology, but Pytheas had found mathematical evidence in astronomical calculations that such a place could exist at extreme northern latitudes. After weeks of negotiation, the merchants agreed. They would fund one ship, provide provisions for 6 months, and crew it with 30 experienced sailors, but they made one condition: Pytheas must return with proof. Without evidence, without witnesses, his word would mean nothing. But here's what makes this even more chilling. Pytheas accepted those terms, knowing they were impossible to fulfill, because the places he intended to visit were so far beyond known experience that no amount of evidence would convince skeptics. He was walking into a trap of his own making. The ship departed on a spring morning, when the winds were favorable and the gods seemed willing. Pytheas stood at the helm, watching Massalia fade into the distance, unaware that he was sailing toward a destiny that would haunt him forever. The vessel was called the Oceanus, a sturdy merchant ship, retrofitted for long-distance exploration, with reinforced hull planking and extra sail capacity. The crew was carefully selected. His first mate, Alexios, was a veteran of 20 Mediterranean campaigns. The navigator, Alexios, had sailed as far as the Tin Islands off Britannia. There was Theron, the ship's carpenter, whose skills would prove vital in the frozen north, and young Alexios, barely 16, who served as Pytheas's personal assistant and scribe. "Will we really see the edge of the world?" Alexios asked on their first night at sea, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. Pytheas smiled gently. "There is no edge, boy, only horizons we haven't yet crossed. But yes, we will see things no Greek has witnessed, and that is both our blessing and our curse." He didn't explain what he meant. How could he tell this eager young man that discovery comes with a price, that the world punishes those who see too far, too soon? The first leg of the journey was familiar territory. They sailed along the Iberian coast, past the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, and into the wild Atlantic. The crew was uneasy. Mediterranean sailors rarely ventured into these waters. The Atlantic was unpredictable, its storms legendary, its currents treacherous. Pytheas spent his days taking measurements. He used a gnomon, a vertical sundial, to calculate latitude by measuring the sun's shadow at noon. He noted the changing length of days as they traveled north. He documented the temperature of the water, the behavior of seabirds, the types of fish caught in their nets. Every observation was recorded in meticulous detail. Young Alexios wrote everything down in 2 sets of journals, one for the merchants, one for Pytheas's private records. The boy didn't understand understand why they needed two versions, but Pytheas had insisted. Some truths, Pytheas told him quietly one evening, must be preserved separately, because when men don't want to believe something, they destroy the evidence. But what nobody on that ship knew was that the Atlantic itself was about to test them in ways they couldn't imagine. 3 weeks into the journey, they encountered their first major storm. It came without warning, a wall of black clouds racing toward them from the west. The sea, which had been relatively calm, transformed into a churning nightmare of waves taller than the ship's mast. All hands, Alexios roared, secure the cargo, lower the mainsail. The crew scrambled. Pytheas gripped the rail, calculating wind direction and wave patterns even as water crashed over the deck. This was valuable data, if they survived to record it. The storm lasted 2 days. The Oceanus was thrown about like a toy in a child's bath. 3 sailors were injured when a yardarm broke free and swung wildly across the deck. The ship's carpenter, Theron, worked frantically to plug leaks as seawater poured into the hold. Through it all, Pytheas remained on deck observing. He noted how the waves moved in patterns. He measured the wind's intensity. He watched how the stars disappeared behind the storm clouds and calculated their position when they briefly emerged. Alexios grabbed him by the shoulder during the worst of it. "Get below, you'll be washed overboard." "Not yet," Pytheas shouted over the howling wind. "I need to see how the currents behave at the storm's peak." "You're mad." Perhaps he was, but madness and genius often wear the same face, and Pytheas was determined to document everything, even if it killed him. When the storm finally passed, the crew was exhausted but alive. They had lost some supplies, but the ship was intact. More importantly, though they didn't know it yet, they had been blown significantly off course. Instead of following the coast, they were now heading into open Atlantic waters, further west than any Greek ship had intentionally sailed. And that's when Pytheas noticed something that would change everything. The stars were wrong. Not wrong exactly, but different. The constellations he had used for navigation his entire life were shifting position. New stars were appearing on the northern horizon, stars that weren't visible from Mediterranean latitudes. This confirmed his theories about the spherical nature of the Earth and the changing perspective at different latitudes. "Look," he told Alexios, pointing at the night sky. "That star there. See how it sits almost directly over the northern horizon. In Massalia, it would be lower. This means we've traveled much farther north than any Greek has documented. Is that good?" the boy asked nervously. Pytheas smiled, but there was a shadow in his eyes. "It's extraordinary and terrifying, because now we're truly in unknown waters." Over the following weeks they followed the coast of what we now call France and Britain. Pytheas meticulously mapped every inlet, every river mouth, every settlement they encountered. He measured the tides, something that fascinated him because they were so much more dramatic in the Atlantic than in the Mediterranean. He developed a theory that the moon influenced tides, an idea that would be mocked by scholars for centuries, until it was finally proven correct. But here, watching the massive tidal shifts in Atlantic coastal waters, the connection seemed obvious to Pytheas. They traded with local Celtic tribes, exchanging Mediterranean goods for food and information. Pytheas learned about lands further north, islands shrouded in mist, places where the sun's behavior grew strange, and mysterious territories no trader had successfully reached.
"They speak of Thulul," Pytheas told Alexios one evening, "a land 6 days' sail north of Britain, a place where summer brings endless day." Alexios frowned. "And you believe them?" "I believe the mathematics. The further north we travel, the longer the days become. There must be a latitude where at summer solstice the sun doesn't set at all. Whether that place is called Thulul or something else, I intend to find it." But here's what Pytheas didn't share with his first mate. The Celtic traders had told him something else. They spoke of ships that had sailed north and never returned, of a sea that turned solid, of places where men's minds broke under the weight of endless daylight or eternal darkness. They warned him that Thulul was not meant for mortals. Pytheas recorded these warnings in his private journal, but he didn't heed them. As they rounded the northern tip of Britain, a wild, windswept place the locals called Orcus, the crew's unease grew palpable. The days were now astonishingly long. At midnight the sun barely dipped below the horizon before climbing again. Many sailors found they couldn't sleep, disturbed by the constant twilight. "It's unnatural," one sailor muttered. "The gods never intended for day and night to blur like this." "The gods created the entire world," Pytheas countered, "including this place. We are simply seeing parts of their creation that Greeks have never witnessed." But privately, even Pytheas felt the strangeness of it. There was something profoundly disorienting about the endless daylight. His internal sense of time began to drift. He found himself taking astronomical measurements at what he thought was noon, only to realize hours had passed without his noticing. Young Alexios grew pale and withdrawn. "I keep having dreams," he confessed to Pytheas. "Dreams where the sun speaks to me. It says we've gone too far, that we should turn back."
Dreams are just our minds processing fear, Pytheas said gently. But he wrote the boy's words in his journal, because he was having similar dreams, and then they saw something that should have made them turn back immediately. They were sailing through waters scattered with small rocky islands when the lookout cried out. At first, Pytheas thought it was just another island, but as they drew closer, he realized what he was seeing. Ice, a massive chunk of ice, blue-white and crystalline, floating in the sea like a mountain broken free from the land. It was larger than their ship, towering above the waves, its submerged portion surely far more massive than what showed above the surface. The crew gathered at the rail, staring in stunned silence. "What is it?" Kletos whispered. "Frozen water." "But how? Water doesn't freeze in the sea." But it did. Pytheas had read the ancient Phoenician accounts. He knew intellectually that water could freeze, but seeing it here, in the open ocean, was something else entirely. It was like watching the rules of nature rewrite themselves. "It's ice," Pytheas said, his voice filled with wonder. "We must be approaching the region where the sea itself begins to freeze. This changes everything we know about the world." Alexios pulled him aside. "That's what you wanted to find, isn't it? The frozen sea from the old legends. You've found it. Now we can turn back." "No," Pytheas said firmly. "This is just one piece of ice. I need to see the source. I need to reach the place where the sea truly freezes. The men won't stand for it. They're already frightened. Half of them think we've sailed into Poseidon's private realm. If we go further, then we go further," Pytheas interrupted. "That's why we're here." But that night, something happened that Pytheas hadn't anticipated. The crew held a secret meeting. Alexios overheard them and warned Pytheas. "They're planning to take control of the ship," the boy whispered urgently. "They want to turn around. Some are saying you've been possessed by a demon, that you're leading them to their deaths." Pytheas felt his stomach tighten. He had expected resistance, but not outright mutiny. He needed to act carefully. The next morning he called all hands on deck. He stood before them, looking each man in the eye. "I know you're afraid," he began. "I know this place seems wrong to Mediterranean sailors. The endless day, the floating ice, the strange cold, all of it challenges what we know. But listen to me. We are making history. We are seeing things no Greek has ever witnessed. Your names will be remembered alongside mine as the first to map the frozen north. Or will be remembered as the fools who followed a madman to their deaths," one sailor called out. "Perhaps," Pytheas acknowledged, "but consider this. We've already come further than any Greek expedition. If we turn back now, you'll still be heroes, but you'll always wonder what lay beyond that next horizon, and so will I." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I propose a vote. Those who wish to continue north, raise your hands. Those who wish to turn back, do the same. Majority decides our course." It was a calculated risk. By giving them a choice, he was also giving them ownership of the decision. Majority decides our course. It was a calculated risk. By giving them a choice, he was also giving them ownership of the decision. What an origam, but comty to say spy nat sigilis place. Board lad patai tuyens the medding by them, comty to solve and fro plats longy, mis precinct comty to say tun saps, and one ging to dem all sap to seeking dadam madat, vor, me the stuthite to mumbered and pito tout chairs. It was Wendy de Miris, Pytovite, Mulkorth Paul Gaftetin to Pydom and Nuts, near this peas to plough fight in lorries, and great granotin sabath whatnot, vodin knocked the your sapt of the foul talking shows sapple, wadin south pumage, and humans. Pytheas knew, were curious creatures, even scared. They wanted to see what came next. The vote was close. 18 to continue, 12 to turn back. Alexios abstained, but his expression suggested he thought they were all mad. "North it is," Pytheas declared, "but I promise you this. At the first sign that the ship is in real danger, we turn back. I'm seeking knowledge, not death." It was a lie. Pytheas would have sailed into death itself for knowledge, but the crew needed to hear it. What happened next would test that promise in ways nobody expected. As they sailed further north, the ice became more frequent, no longer isolated bergs but fields of it, chunks and sheets floating in the dark water, creating a maze they had to carefully navigate. The temperature dropped dramatically. Men who had never experienced real cold were soon shivering despite layers of clothing. Theron, the carpenter, fashioned crude mittens from spare sailcloth. The cook struggled to keep fires burning in the increasingly damp conditions. Pytheas himself felt his fingers growing numb as he tried to take measurements, but the ice wasn't the worst of it. The worst was what the ice did to the sea itself. They entered a region where the water had become thick, sluggish. It wasn't fully frozen, but it wasn't liquid either. It moved like honey, offering resistance to their oars and rudder. Pytheas would later describe this as the congealed sea, a term that would be mocked for centuries as pure fantasy, but it was real. He was experiencing what we now call pancake ice or grease ice, the early stages of sea ice formation where ice crystals create a thick, soupy consistency on the water's surface. "The sea is dying," one sailor moaned. "We've sailed too far from the sun's warmth. We're in the realm of eternal winter." Pytheas tried to explain the science, how cold temperatures affected water, how latitude influenced climate, but his words fell on terrified ears. These men understood the sea as a living thing with moods and temperament. This sluggish, half-frozen water felt wrong to them at a primal level. "We need to turn back," Alexios said firmly, "before we become trapped." "One more day," Pytheas pleaded. "Look there, through the fog, I see land." It was true. Dark cliffs were visible through the mist, emerging from the ice-choked sea. This had to be it. This had to be Thule. "One more day," Alexios agreed reluctantly. "But if we can't reach shore and take your measurements by sunset, if the sun ever actually sets in this cursed place, we leave. Trapped in this ice, we die. Understand?" Pytheas understood. He also understood he would probably never get another chance. They spent the next 12 hours carefully maneuvering through the ice, sometimes using oars to push aside smaller chunks, other times having to backtrack and find alternate routes. The ship's hull groaned under the pressure. Theron inspected it constantly, checking for cracks. But slowly, painfully, they approached the shore, and what Pytheas found there would become both his greatest discovery and his greatest burden. The land was inhabited. People lived here, in this frozen extremity of the world, and they had adapted in ways that seemed impossible to Mediterranean eyes. As the Oceanurus anchored in a sheltered bay, Pytheas saw figures watching from the shore, wrapped in heavy furs, faces weathered by cold, eyes wary but curious. Pytheas took Alexios and 3 armed sailors in a small boat to shore. The moment his feet touched the frozen ground, he felt a thrill run through him. He was standing on Thule, the legendary land, the place that shouldn't exist. The local people approached slowly. Communication was difficult. Their language bore no resemblance to any Greek, Celtic or Germanic tongue Pytheas knew. But through gestures, through patience, through the universal language of trade, they began to understand each other. The people called their land something that sounded to Pytheas's ear like Thule, or perhaps Tile. They were fishermen and hunters, living in structures partially built into the earth for warmth. They used tools made of bone and stone, wore clothes fashioned from seal and polar bear skins. Through careful observation over the next 3 days, Alexios had grudgingly allowed an extension. Pytheas learned extraordinary things. The people explained through gestures that during winter the sun disappeared completely for months, the sky filled with strange dancing lights, what we now call aurora borealis. The sea froze solid enough to walk on. They hunted seals by waiting at breathing holes in the ice, and during summer, now the sun barely set, it touched the horizon and immediately rose again. Day and night became meaningless concepts. Pytheas set up his instruments. He carefully measured the sun's position at what should have been midnight. He calculated latitude. He documented everything: the people's diet, their hunting methods, their clothing, the local animals, the plants that managed to grow in this harsh climate. He collected samples, strange mosses, bird feathers, even a small carved figurine one of the locals gave him. Evidence, proof, witnesses to what he had found. Young Alexios drew sketches of the people, their dwellings, their tools. He interviewed them as best he could, recording their words phonetically, even though he didn't understand them. "Master," Alexios said on their final evening ashore, "will anyone believe us, even with all this evidence?" Pytheas looked at the boy, at his earnest young face, and felt a wave of sadness. "Some will, most won't, but we'll have the truth, and that's what matters." But he was lying to the boy, and to himself, because Pytheas was already beginning to understand that truth without belief is just noise in the wind. On their last night on Thule, something happened that Pytheas never recorded in his official journals, only in his private notes, the ones meant for no one else's eyes. An elderly local man, someone who seemed to be a leader or shaman, approached Pytheas as he sat alone near the shore. The man spoke in his own language, but his gestures and tone were clear. He was warning Pytheas about something. Through painstaking effort, Pytheas understood. The man was telling him that speaking of this place to outsiders was dangerous, that there were reasons Thule remained hidden, that those who revealed its existence never found peace. "Is that a threat?" Pytheas asked, though he knew the man couldn't understand. The elder shook his head. He pointed south, toward the sea, toward the distant lands of the Mediterranean. Then he made a gesture like closing a mouth, followed by another like being struck down. He wasn't threatening Pytheas, he was warning him that others would. "They won't believe me anyway," Pytheas said, more to himself than to the elder. The old man seemed to understand the tone, if not the words. He placed a hand on Pythias's shoulder, a gesture of sympathy. Then he pressed something into Pythias's palm, a small stone, carved with symbols Pythias didn't recognize. "For proof?" Pythias asked. The elder shook his head. He pointed to the stone, then to his own heart, then to Pythias's heart. "Not for proof, for truth, for remembering what was real when everyone else insisted it wasn't." Pythias kept that stone for the rest of his life. It was one of the few things he never showed to anyone, not even Alexios, because by the time he understood what the elder had been trying to tell him, it was too late. The journey back was harder than the journey north. The seas were rough, supplies were running low, and the crew's mood had turned dark. They had seen the impossible, and instead of wonder, they felt contaminated by it, like they had witnessed something humans weren't meant to see. But what Pythias didn't realize was that the real danger wasn't the journey home, it was what was being said on the ship. 3 days into their return voyage, Pythias overheard 2 sailors talking in hushed tones near the cargo hold. "Can't tell people what we saw," one was saying. "They'll think we're possessed." "The ice made sense," the other replied. "Cold makes water freeze, but a sea that's not quite frozen, not quite liquid, and those people living where no people should survive. If we tell that story, we'll never get work on another ship. So what do we say? We say we sailed north. We say the days got long. We say we saw ice. But all that other stuff, the frozen sea that moves like porridge, the land where the sun won't set, that's Pythias's fantasy. Let him tell it. We'll say he misunderstood what he saw." Pythias felt ice form in his stomach that had nothing to do with the northern cold. They were already planning to betray him. To save their own reputations, they would sacrifice his. He confronted Alexios that evening. "The men are planning to discredit me when we return." Alexios looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "Can you blame them? What we saw, it sounds like madness when you try to put it into words. Frozen seas that aren't quite frozen, lands where the sun circles the sky. Even I'm not sure what we witnessed up there." "You were there," Pytheas said desperately. "You saw the same things I did." "I saw things I can't explain," Alexios admitted, "and that terrifies me more than any storm. At least I understand storms. But what we saw in the north, that breaks reality, and men don't like broken reality, Pytheas. They'll do anything to put it back together, even if it means calling you a liar. So you'll join them? You'll say I invented it all?" Alexios was quiet for a long moment. "I'll say I don't know what we saw, that the cold and the strange light played tricks on our minds, that things seemed strange but might have had natural explanations we didn't understand. I won't call you a liar, Pytheas, but I won't confirm your story either. It was a compromise that felt like a knife in the back, but the real betrayal came from someone Pytheas never expected." As they sailed past Britain, heading south toward familiar waters, young Alexios came to Pythias's cabin late one night. The boy's eyes were red from crying. "Master, I need to tell you something," he began, his voice shaking. "The crew, they've been talking to me. They said if I support your account of Thule, I'll never become a navigator, that I'll be marked as a fantasist, that my career will be over before it begins." Pythias felt his heart sink. "And what did you tell them?" I told them I would think about it." Alexios looked at his feet. "Master, I'm 16. I have my whole life ahead of me. If I stand with you and everyone calls us liars, what kind of life will I have? A life built on truth," Pythias said quietly, "but also a difficult one. I won't lie to you about that. I have all the sketches," Alexios said, tears flowing now, "all the measurements, all the observations, but they said drawings can be faked, measurements can be wrong, that without witnesses willing to testify, evidence is meaningless." "They're right," Pythias admitted. "That's the cruel thing about truth. It needs believers to survive." "I'm sorry," Alexios whispered. "I'm so sorry, but I can't throw away my future for this. I can't." Pythias looked at the boy, really looked at him. He saw fear there, and shame, but also pragmatism. Alexios was making the smart choice, the survivable choice. "Keep one set of notes," Pythias said finally. "Hide them, don't show anyone, but keep them, so that when you're old and your career is secure, you'll have proof that you were there, that it was real. You're not angry." "Oh, I'm angry," Pythias said with a bitter smile. "Furious, heartbroken, betrayed, but I also understand. You're choosing life over truth. truth. Most people make that choice. I'm the fool for choosing differently. Alexios left the cabin, and Pytheas sat alone in the dark, listening to the creak of the ship and the whisper of the sea. He opened his private journal and wrote, "Today I learned that discovery has a price, not in gold or hardship, but in isolation. The explorer who ventures too far returns to a world that no longer has room for him." But he had no idea how true those words would become. The Oceanus arrived back in Massalia on a cool autumn morning, 6 months after departing. A crowd had gathered at the docks, families of the crew, merchants who had funded the expedition, scholars curious about the results. Pytheas stood at the bow, his boxes of samples and notes at his feet, his face weathered by 6 months of sun and salt and wind. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt hollow. As the crew disembarked, he noticed how they avoided looking at him, how they gathered in small groups, heads together, whispering. The betrayal was already in motion. The merchants demanded an immediate report. Pytheas stood before them in the same hall where he had proposed the expedition, but now the atmosphere was different, expectant, hungry. They wanted profit, not wonder. "Gentlemen," Pytheas began, "I have returned from the furthest north any Greek has traveled. I have reached approximately 63 degrees latitude, a full 20 degrees beyond the Mediterranean. I have documented lands, peoples, and phenomena unknown to our civilization." "Yes, yes," the head merchant interrupted impatiently. "But what about trade routes? What about resources? Can we establish commerce with these northern lands?" Pytheas hesitated. "The lands are inhospitable for standard Mediterranean trade. The climate is harsh, the sailing conditions dangerous, but the peoples there have furs, amber, other goods that could be valuable, with proper preparation." "So you're saying the expedition was a failure?" another merchant cut in. 6 months, substantial investment, and you return with what? Stories of ice and strange people. "I return with knowledge," Pytheas said, feeling his anger rise. "I have measured the latitude precisely. I have documented the midnight sun. I have witnessed the ocean in a state of freezing that challenges our understanding of water itself. I have samples, measurements, observations about this frozen sea," a scholar in the back said, his tone skeptical. "Describe it again." Pytheas explained the congealed sea, how it was neither fully liquid nor solid. He could see the disbelief spreading across their faces like a stain. "And you expect us to believe," the scholar continued, "that the ocean simply becomes thick, like honey? This violates every principle of natural philosophy. I know how it sounds," Pytheas said desperately, "but I witnessed it. I have measurements of the temperature, observations of how the ship moved through it." "Did your crew witness this?" the merchant asked. The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at the crew members who had gathered at the back of the hall. Alexios stepped forward. We saw ice, large amounts of ice. The water was certainly cold, and navigation was difficult. But as for the sea becoming thick like porridge," he shrugged. "The conditions were strange. Perhaps the captain misinterpreted what he saw. It was a carefully worded betrayal, not a direct contradiction, but a planting of doubt." "And the land where the sun doesn't set?" another scholar pressed. "This Thule you claim to have reached." "We did reach a northern land," Alexios said. "The days were very long there, certainly. At midnight the sun was low on the horizon, but did it truly never set? In the confusion of endless twilight, it was hard to say. The captain has more precise measurements than I do." Again the careful hedge, not calling Pytheas a liar, but suggesting his observations might be flawed. One by one crew members were questioned. Some supported parts of Pytheas's account. Yes, they had sailed very far north. Yes, there was a lot of ice. Yes, the days were unusually long. But the more extraordinary claims, the frozen sea that wasn't quite frozen, the midnight sun, the specific measurements and calculations, they demurred. They said things had been confusing. They suggested Pytheas might have been too eager to see wonders and had misinterpreted natural phenomena. Even young Alexios, when questioned, said carefully, "Master Pytheas is a brilliant astronomer, but the conditions in the far north were very challenging. Perhaps some observations were affected by the extreme environment. It was a massacre by 1,000 cuts. But the killing blow came from someone Pytheas had never even met. A rival scholar named Eratosthenes stood up. He was younger than Pytheas, ambitious, brilliant, and jealous of Pytheas's reputation. "Let me see if I understand," Eratosthenes said smoothly. "You claim to have sailed to a latitude where the sun doesn't set. You claim the ocean freezes into a semi-solid state. You claim to have met people surviving in conditions that should be impossible for human life. And your evidence is, what? Samples of moss, drawings by a teenage boy, measurements that no one else can verify. The measurements can be verified, Pytheas insisted. Send another expedition. Follow my route. You'll see. Ah, but that's the beauty of your claims, isn't it? Eratosthenes smiled. They're just far enough away, just difficult enough to reach. That verification would require another massive investment. Very convenient. I'm not lying. Pythias's voice cracked with frustration. I didn't say you were lying, Eratosthenes replied. I said you were mistaken, or perhaps imaginative. There's a difference. A liar knows the truth and chooses to deceive, but a fantasist believes his own delusions. Which are you, Pytheas? The room erupted in murmurs. Pytheas stood frozen, realizing with horrible clarity that Eratosthenes had just reframed the entire narrative. He wasn't being called a liar, he was being called delusional, and somehow that was worse. I have written a complete account, Pytheas said, struggling to maintain his composure. Detailed observations, measurements, calculations. I call it On the Ocean. It will be circulated among scholars. Future generations will vindicate these observations. I look forward to reading it, Eratosthenes said with false politeness. I'm sure it will be quite imaginative. The meeting ended badly. The merchants declared the expedition a financial loss and refused to fund any follow-up voyage. Scholars muttered among themselves about Pythias's declining reliability. Even his longtime supporters looked troubled. As the crowd dispersed, Pytheas stood alone in the empty hall, clutching his journals to his chest. He had discovered the frozen north. He had reached Thule. He had documented phenomena that would reshape geography and astronomy, and nobody believed him. But the nightmare was only beginning. Over the following weeks, Pytheas threw himself into writing On the Ocean. He worked obsessively, recording every detail, every measurement, every observation. He included his calculations of latitude, his theories about tides and the moon, his descriptions of the peoples he had encountered. He wrote with scientific precision, laying out his methodology, explaining his reasoning, anticipating objections. He included drawings, diagrams, charts. He made it as comprehensive and rigorous as possible. When he finally released the manuscript for circulation, he dared to hope. Surely when scholars read the full account, saw the careful logic and detailed observations, they would reconsider their skepticism. Instead, On the Ocean became a scandal. Scholars tore it apart. They said his descriptions were impossible. They said his measurements must be wrong. They said he had clearly combined second-hand accounts from traders with his own fantasies. They said the work was creative fiction, masquerading as geography. Eratosthenes led the assault, writing a detailed rebuttal that pointed out every element of Pythias's account that contradicted accepted natural philosophy. The frozen sea, impossible. Water is liquid or solid, not something in between. The midnight sun, mathematically implausible. The people of Thule, exaggerated from traders' tales. Pytheas has demonstrated, Eratosthenes wrote, that a brilliant astronomer can become lost in his own imagination when separated from the anchor of rational skepticism. His journey may have been real, but his account has been contaminated by a desperate desire to seem more adventurous than he was. The words cut deeper than any sword, because Eratosthenes hadn't just attacked Pythias's credibility, he had poisoned his legacy. Other scholars began citing Eratosthenes's critique as the definitive response to Pythias's claims. Within months, On the Ocean went from controversial to laughable. Students who had once sought to study under Pythias withdrew. The few who remained did so out of pity rather than respect. Other astronomers avoided association with him, fearing their own reputations would be tarnished. Pytheas found himself increasingly isolated. Invitations to symposia dried up. His opinions were no longer sought. When he tried to present his tidal theories at a scholarly gathering, the audience laughed before he finished speaking. Perhaps the moon made the frozen sea congeal, someone called out, and the room erupted in cruel laughter. Pytheas left that gathering and never attended another. But here's the most heartbreaking part. Pytheas began to doubt himself. Late at night, alone in his study, he would pull out his journals and read through his observations. Had he misinterpreted what he saw? Had the extreme conditions affected his judgment? Was it possible that the congealed sea was just thick fog over normal water? That the midnight sun was a trick of light refraction? No, he had taken measurements. He had calculations. He had witnesses who saw the same things, even if they later denied it. But doubt is a poison, and once it enters the mind, it spreads. Pytheas found himself adding qualifications to his private notes. I believe I observed, it appeared to be, if my calculations were correct, the certainty that had once driven him was crumbling. One night, he nearly threw all his journals into the fire. He stood there, papers in hand, flames dancing before him, and thought, what's the point? Why preserve observations nobody will ever believe? His hand trembled over the flames. Then he thought of the elder on Thule, pressing that carved stone into his palm. A reminder to hold truth in his heart, even when the world denied it. Pytheas stepped back from the fire. He carefully put the journals away in a locked chest. They would survive, even if his reputation didn't. But the psychological toll was devastating. Friends who had known Pytheas as confident and brilliant now saw a man who seemed hollowed out, haunted. He stopped taking new students. He rarely left his home. When he did venture out, he sometimes caught people pointing at him, whispering, "That's the one who claimed he sailed to the edge of the world." The mocking tone was unmistakable. Years passed. Pytheas grew older, more withdrawn. He continued his astronomical observations. They were the one thing nobody could mock, because the stars didn't lie. But his work on geography and exploration was finished. No one would fund another expedition. No one trusted his observations. And then something happened that crushed whatever hope remained in Pytheas's heart. Alexios, his former first mate, published his own account of the voyage. It was brief, carefully worded, and presented as a correction of Pytheas's exaggerations. In Alexios's version, they had sailed north along the British coast. They had encountered ice and cold weather. They had traded with northern peoples. But the fantastic elements, the congealed sea, the midnight sun at Thule, the extreme latitude measurements, these were described as Pytheas's interpretations, which I cannot confirm. Alexios presented himself as a voice of reason, trying to salvage some truth from Pytheas's fantasy. The scholarly community embraced Alexios's account. Finally, they said, "We have a reliable report of the northern voyage, someone who admits the journey happened, but strips away the impossible claims." Pytheas read Alexios's account in numb silence. The betrayal was complete. His own first mate, who had stood beside him on the deck of the Oceanos, who had seen the ice fields and the endless daylight, who had set foot on Thule's frozen shore, that man had now become his most effective critic, because Alexios wasn't calling Pytheas a liar. He was calling him mistaken, confused, perhaps slightly unbalanced by the rigors of the journey, and that narrative was far more damaging than outright accusations of fraud. Pytheas considered writing a response. He drafted several versions, each more desperate than the last, but in the end he never published them, because he realized with terrible clarity that defending himself would only make him look more delusional. The man who insists too loudly that he's telling the truth is the man nobody believes. So Pytheas fell silent. He spent his remaining years in quiet astronomical work, teaching a handful of students who still sought him out, and maintaining his private journals. He never spoke publicly about Thule again. When asked about his voyage, he would simply say, "I traveled north. I saw many things. Others may interpret them as they wish." It was a surrender disguised as dignity. But there was one thing Pytheas did in his final years that suggests he never truly gave up hope. He made copies of his journals, multiple copies, hidden in different locations. He gave one to a trusted student with instructions to preserve it. He sent another to the Library of Alexandria with a note, "For future generations who may understand what my own contemporaries could not." He also added a final entry to his private journal, written in his shaky elderly hand. "I have been called a liar, a fantasist and a fool. Perhaps I am all these things, but I know what I saw. I stood on the shores of Thule. I sailed through seas thick with forming ice. I measured the sun at a latitude no Greek had reached before. These things are true, regardless of who believes them. If you are reading this in some distant future, know that I died with the burden of discovered truth that could find no believers. Know that I paid the price for seeing what others could not imagine, and know that if you ever discover something beyond the boundaries of accepted knowledge, you too will face this choice. Remain silent and be safe, or speak truth and be destroyed. I chose truth. I do not regret it, but I do not recommend it." Pytheas of Massalia died sometime around 285 BCE. The exact date is unknown. Few noticed his passing. There was no great funeral, no scholarly gathering to honor his contributions. He was remembered, if at all, as the astronomer who had gone mad with ambition and claimed to have reached mythical lands. His book, On the Ocean, remained in circulation, but primarily as an example of how even brilliant minds can be led astray. Scholars referenced it mainly to criticize it, to show their students what happens when observation is contaminated by imagination. The original journals chronicles, the detailed day-by-day account of the voyage, disappeared, perhaps destroyed, perhaps lost, perhaps hidden somewhere still undiscovered. For centuries, Pytheas was exactly what his critics had called him, a cautionary tale. And then, slowly, inexorably, the world began to catch up to what he had seen. Roman expansion brought legions into northern Gaul and Britannia. Roman merchants sailed the same routes Pytheas had documented, and they began to report strange things. In the far north, they said, the ocean did strange things in winter. It became thick, difficult to navigate, not quite frozen, but not quite liquid either. Roman astronomers in Britain noted that the summer days grew astonishingly long, the further north one travelled. At the very northern reaches, the sun barely dipped below the horizon at midnight during summer solstice. Roman traders encountered peoples who wore heavy furs and lived in partially underground dwellings. They traded for amber and described the harsh northern climate. Slowly, piece by piece, Pytheas's observations were being confirmed. But here's the bitter irony. The Romans didn't realize they were confirming Pytheas. They thought they were making new discoveries. Because Pytheas's account had been so thoroughly discredited that nobody thought to check it against these new observations. It wasn't until the geographer Strabo, writing around 20 BCE, compiled previous geographical knowledge that someone actually re-examined Pytheas's work. Strabo was skeptical. He called Pytheas an arch-falsifier, but he also preserved extensive quotations from On the Ocean in his own geographical work, which is the only reason we know about Pytheas's journey at all. The original text has been lost, but Strabo's quotations survived, and as Strabo quoted Pytheas's descriptions to mock them, other scholars began to notice something. These fantasies matched what Roman explorers were now reporting. The cognitive dissonance was enormous. How could Pytheas's false account align so closely with verified observations? Some scholars suggested Pytheas had been lucky, that he had made wild guesses that happened to be correct. Others proposed that Roman explorers had been influenced by reading Pytheas and had imagined seeing what they expected to see. But a few, a very few, began to wonder, what if Pytheas had been telling the truth all along? This minority view remained just that, a minority for centuries more. The scholarly consensus remained that Pytheas had exaggerated or misinterpreted what he saw. His reputation as a fraud was too entrenched to overcome easily, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. Medieval scholars reading both Pytheas through Strabo's quotations and Roman accounts noted the correlations. They began to treat Pytheas's observations with more respect, even if they didn't fully believe all of them. Viking Age explorers, sailing the same northern waters, encountered the same phenomena Pytheas had described. They spoke of the pack ice, the midnight sun, the harsh conditions. They settled Iceland and encountered conditions identical to what Pytheas had documented for Thule. Some scholars began to propose that Thule might have been Iceland, or perhaps the Norwegian coast, or the Shetland Islands. Debate raged, but the debate itself represented progress, because scholars were now taking seriously the possibility that Thule actually existed. By the Renaissance, Pytheas was being reassessed. His astronomical observations were studied and found to be remarkably accurate. His tidal theories were recognized as groundbreaking. His latitude calculations were checked against new navigational techniques and found to be precise. One by one, the impossible elements of his account were being verified. The congealed sea. Maritime explorers recognized this as an accurate description of pancake ice and grease ice, the early stages of sea ice formation. Far from being fantasy, it was a precise observation of a real phenomenon that Mediterranean sailors had simply never encountered. The midnight sun. Astronomical calculations confirmed that at 63 degrees north latitude, exactly where Pytheas claimed to have traveled, the sun would indeed remain visible all night during summer solstice. The people of Thule. Anthropological studies of Arctic and subarctic cultures showed that humans had indeed adapted to survive in the harsh conditions Pytheas described, using exactly the methods he documented. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the scholarly consensus had completely reversed. Pytheas was now recognized as a pioneering scientific explorer whose observations were not only accurate but remarkably advanced for his era. Historians studied his work with awe, recognizing the sophistication of his methods. He had used astronomical observation for precise latitude calculation. He had recognized the connection between the moon and tides. He had documented cultures and phenomena with scientific objectivity. He had been right about everything, but the vindication came 2,000 years too late. Pytheas never knew that future generations would call him a genius. He never knew that his name would be honored in geography textbooks. He never knew that scholars would spend centuries trying to trace his exact route, treating On the Ocean as a valuable historical document rather than a work of fiction. He died thinking he had failed. Modern scholars have tried to reconstruct Pytheas's exact journey based on his descriptions and calculations. The consensus is that he sailed from Massilia, Marseille, through the Strait of Gibraltar, up the Atlantic coast to Brittany, across to Cornwall and the tin mines of Britain, then north along the British coast to Scotland, and possibly beyond to the Shetland Islands or even Norway. The congealed sea he encountered was likely the edge of the Arctic pack ice, which in ancient times extended further south than it does today due to different climate patterns. Thule was probably the Norwegian coast, though some scholars argue for Iceland or the Shetlands. The exact location remains debated, but the debate itself validates that the place was real. Pytheas's astronomical observations have been checked against modern calculations. His measurement of the summer solstice sun position at Massalia was accurate to within a fraction of a degree. His latitude calculations for various points on his journey have been verified using his recorded sun positions. His description of tidal patterns in Atlantic waters was so accurate that it became the foundation for later tidal studies. His recognition that the moon influenced tides was centuries ahead of its time. This wouldn't be widely accepted until the work of Newton in the 17th century. In short, Pytheas of Massalia was one of the greatest scientific explorers of the ancient world. He combined the skills of a navigator, an astronomer, a geographer, and an ethnographer. He ventured into completely unknown territory and returned with accurate, detailed observations that advanced human knowledge significantly, and his contemporaries called him a liar. Today there are memorials to Pytheas. Craters on the Moon and Mars are named after him. Maritime history museums feature exhibits about his voyage. Scholars write papers analyzing his route and methodology. He is taught in schools as a pioneer of exploration and scientific observation, but these honors are meaningless to the man who needed them. Pytheas died in isolation and disgrace, carrying the burden of truth that nobody would accept. And that raises the question that haunts his story. How many other Pytheas figures are there in history? How many people discovered truths that were too far ahead of their time, spoke what they saw and were destroyed for it? How many accurate observations were dismissed as fantasy because they contradicted accepted knowledge? How many explorers returned from distant lands with real discoveries, only to be called liars because what they saw seemed impossible? The archives of history are full of discredited accounts that might have been true, the ancient texts dismissed as myth that might contain real observations, the explorers mocked as frauds who might have actually reached the places they described. Pytheas's vindication proves that sometimes the liars were telling the truth, but his tragedy proves that vindication means nothing if it comes after you're dead. There's one final haunting detail about Pytheas's story. In 1945, an archaeological excavation in southern France uncovered a sealed jar containing ancient documents. Among them was a letter, written in archaic Greek from someone named Alexios. The letter was addressed to whoever may find this, and dated approximately to 270 BCE, about 15 years after Pytheas's death. It read, "I was young when I sailed north with Pytheas. I saw everything he later described, the frozen seas, the midnight sun, the land called Thule. I drew the pictures. I recorded the measurements. I was there, but when we returned, I denied him. I chose my career over truth. I told myself he would be fine, that someone else would support him, that my testimony wouldn't matter anyway. I was wrong. My silence mattered. Every silence mattered. Pytheas died last month. I attended his funeral. Almost nobody else did. As they lowered his body into the ground, I wanted to scream. He was telling the truth. I was there. Everything he said was real. But I didn't. Even at his funeral, I remained silent, because speaking would cost me everything I've built in the 15 years since we returned. I am a successful navigator now. I have students' respect, a comfortable life, and I bought all of it with Pytheas's reputation. I write this now because I'm dying. Illness, the physicians say. I have perhaps a month left, and I find I cannot die with this burden. So I write this confession and seal it in this jar. Perhaps someone will find it someday. Perhaps they will know that Pytheas was right, that he died alone and mocked for speaking truth, and perhaps whoever reads this will learn what I learned too late, that silence in the face of truth is its own form of violence, that cowardice has a price, that some choices haunt you forever. I saw Thule. I stood on frozen ground under a sun that wouldn't set. I witnessed everything Pytheas documented, and I said nothing.
I am not the hero of this story. I am its villain, and I deserve no forgiveness. The letter was signed, Alexios, navigator, former student of Pytheas the Truthful. When this letter was discovered and translated, it sent shockwaves through the academic community. Here was direct testimony from a witness to Pytheas's journey, confirming every controversial claim, but the discovery came in 1945. The letter is now housed in a museum in Marseille, not far from where the Oceananus once departed on its journey north. Visitors can read it, can see Alexios's confession of betrayal, can witness his deathbed regret, but Pytheas never knew it existed, never knew that at least one witness felt guilt for denying him, never knew that the truth would eventually emerge, even if far too late. That letter is perhaps the most tragic artifact in the entire story, because it proves that even those who betrayed Pytheas knew he was right. They just chose silence anyway. So the next time someone tells you they've seen something extraordinary, something that challenges everything you believe, pause before you dismiss them. Think of Pytheas, standing before skeptical merchants, trying desperately to explain frozen seas to people who had never left the Mediterranean. Think of him dying alone, branded a fraud, while the truth he discovered waited centuries to be recognized. Think of Alexios, dying with guilt, writing a confession that would arrive 2,000 years too late to save the man he had betrayed. And ask yourself, in that situation, what would you do? Would you have the courage to believe the impossible, or would you join the crowd calling the truth-teller a liar? Because somewhere, right now, there might be someone like Pytheas, someone who has seen something extraordinary, someone trying to share a truth that seems impossible, someone who will be proven right, but only after they're gone. Don't let silence destroy another Pytheas. Don't let fear of the impossible blind you to the truth, because the frozen seas are real, Thule exists, and the greatest tragedy isn't that Pytheas was doubted, it's that he died never knowing he was right. Subscribe to ensure no explorer's truth stays buried, and that the voices history tried to silence are finally heard, because every Pytheas deserves witnesses who will speak, and every truth deserves believers who will listen.